The heavy atmospheric pressure of Prime 12 clung to the outer hull like cooling glass, dense enough to flatten standard carbon-graphene composites under its sheer weight. Far below the cloud decks, where the gravity spiked to nearly double the galactic baseline, the obsidian spires of the High Concordance's orbital terminal loomed like ancient, fossilized ribs against the crimson sky. Ambassador Valen adjusted his internal dampeners, feeling the rhythmic, sickening thrum of his own circulatory system struggling against the planet's crush. He was a Kalan, a species engineered for high-altitude thermal gliders, composed of delicate, light-honed silicate bones and paper-thin respiratory membranes. In this place, his very existence felt like an act of defiance against physics. Standing beside him at the edge of the observation platform was Commodore Kalen Voss, an officer whose carapace bore the pale, bleached scars of the Outer Rim skirmishes. The Commodore did not look down at the world below. He looked at the sealed, reinforced titanium doors at the far end of the transit bay. The doors hissed, the pressurized air tearing outward in a violent, moisture-laden shockwave that smelled faintly of ozone and wet earth. A single figure stepped through. It possessed no armor, no grav assist harness, no visible bio-augmentative skeletal rigs. It wore a coarse, dark fabric that sagged slightly at the shoulders, completely unadorned save for a polished brass clasp at the collar. It moved with a terrifying heavy grace, every step landing with a dense, resonant thud against the ferro-concrete floor that vibrated directly up through Valen's delicate leg nodes. The creature was a human, a survivor of Earth, the apex Deathworld that the Concordance had formerly quarantined 3 centuries prior. Valen instinctively took half a step back, his silica joints clicking sharply in the oppressive air. The human did not look at him. Its eyes, pale, muddy hazel, devoid of the natural bioluminescent sheen common to civilized species, scanned the perimeter of the bay with a cold, mechanical economy of motion. It was evaluating the structural weak points of the room, the placement of the automated defense turrets, and the exact distance between itself and the 2 diplomatic escorts. "Welcome to the High Terminal, Envoy," Valen managed to convey, his vocal synthesizer translating his high-frequency clicks into a flat, level tone. "We appreciate your willingness to accept this summons." The human halted 5 paces away. The air surrounding the creature was perceptibly warmer, radiating a fierce, metabolic heat generated by a biological engine that burned through oxygen at a rate that would have asphyxiated a lesser organism within minutes. "My name is Marcus," the human said. His voice was low, gravelly, vibrating in a frequency range so deep it sent a ripple through the fluid in Valen's inner auditory canals. "Let's skip the ceremonial protocols, Ambassador." "Your council didn't risk opening the quarantine border just to offer me hospitality." Commodore Voss took a rigid step forward, his mantle flaring in a controlled display of military authority. "You stand before the sovereign representatives of the Central Concordance, human. You will address this body with the appropriate—" "Voss," Valen interrupted sharply, raising a fragile, 4-jointed hand to stay his officer. The silence that followed was suffocating. Valen turned back to the human, carefully maintaining a 5-meter buffer zone, the minimum distance mandated by the Emergency Biological Accord. "3 cycles ago," Valen began, his synthesizer humming quietly, "a deep space research vessel, registered to the 3rd Dynasty, vanished near the border of the periphery void. It did not send a distress beacon. It did not experience a drive failure. Its telemetry simply stopped. When our border patrols arrived at the last known coordinates, they found no debris, no radiation signatures, no hull fragments. Marcus's expression remained utterly blank, a stone face carved by millions of years of merciless natural selection. "And you think we crossed the line and took it?" "No," Valen said softly. "We know you didn't. Because 5 hours after the vessel disappeared, the long-range subspace array at Sector 7 recorded something else. A mass shadow, moving through the dark matter currents between systems. A mass shadow, 6 times the size of a Concordance dreadnought. It is not using hyperlanes. It is not bending space. It is displacing it." For the first time, Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. The subtle movement was barely a millimeter, but to Valen's hypersensitive visual tracking, it was as distinct as a flare in the dark. "The Vorn," Marcus muttered. "You know of them?" Voss demanded, his carapace twitching nervously. "We knew they were coming 300 years ago," Marcus replied, his tone devoid of shock, fear, or urgency. "Why do you think we stayed inside our own well, when your concordance offered us a seat at your table? You thought we were hiding in shame, because your council declared our biology too unstable for civilized space." Marcus took a single step closer. Voss's hand twitched toward his sidearm, but the sheer physical presence of the human seemed to anchor the room, dragging the air down into his orbit. "We weren't hiding," Marcus whispered, the sound like dry leaves grinding over stone. "We were building." The human reached into his dark coat and withdrew a small, unpolished metallic cylinder. He did not throw it, nor did he hand it over. He placed it carefully on the edge of a heavy cargo crate between them, then stepped back to his exact former position. Valen extended a long, slender manipulator to retrieve the cylinder. Upon contact, his neural interface automatically decoded the primitive, hardwired optical data stored within. A holographic projection bloomed between them in the dense, heavy air. It did not show a fleet of ships. It did not show a space station or a planetary defense grid. It showed a singular, massive structure anchored in the gravity well of a dead star at the edge of the Sol system. A ring of black, non-reflective metal, thousands of kilometers in diameter, wrapping tightly around the collapsed star's event horizon, feeding on its Hawking radiation, siphoning its raw gravitational potential, and channeling it into a single, forward-facing conduit. What is this?" Valen breathed, his silicate bones shivering from a sudden, visceral chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "That is the reason we haven't spoken to your council in 3 centuries, Marcus said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Your people spent those 300 years debating trade tariffs, writing poetry, and regulating the color of orbital shuttle hulls. You thought the universe was a park built for your comfort." Marcus looked up at the towering, ancient arches of the terminal bay, his gaze cold, detached, and profoundly old. "Our world taught us long before we ever saw the stars that when the winter comes, the weak build fires to stay warm. The strong build weapons to kill whatever is hunting in the dark. The Vorn aren't an armada, Ambassador. They are an extinction event, and they've just entered our hunting grounds." Valen stared at the holographic ring, then at the human standing before him. The creature seemed smaller now, almost insignificant against the backdrop of the crushing gravity and the massive architecture of the concordance. Yet, for the first time in his long, elevated life, Valen realized the true, terrifying nature of the mandate his ancestors had written. They hadn't quarantined Earth to protect the galaxy from a wild, dangerous animal. They had locked the door because they were terrified of the thing that was growing inside the cage. Marcus turned on his heel, his heavy boots striking the ferro-concrete once more, as he walked back toward the dark, hissing transit tube. "Tell your council to pull your fleets back behind the 3rd sector," the human called over his shoulder, his voice echoing off the cold metal walls. "Don't send scouts, don't send diplomats, and above all else, do not get in our way." "Envoy!" Valen shouted, taking an involuntary step into the crushing atmosphere. "What will your people do when the shadow reaches your border?" Marcus stopped at the threshold of the airlock. He did not turn around. "We're going to show them why the universe is quiet," he said quietly. The heavy titanium doors slammed shut, sealing the human away, leaving the 2 alien officers standing alone in the suffocating weight of a world that suddenly felt far too fragile to survive what was coming next. The void beyond the Sol perimeter did not resemble the groomed, well-charted corridors of the central concordance. Here, where the light of distant stars bled into the vast, lifeless expanse of the Oort cloud, the universe was composed of cold basalt, frozen methane, and an oppressive, absolute silence. Inside the command nexus of the heavy cruiser, Aegis 7, the air tasted of recirculated nitrogen and stale moisture. There were no gilded hollows, no ambient bioluminescence, and no decorative architecture. Every wall was reinforced plates of dull carbene alloy, ribbed with heavy dampening cables that groaned under the constant micro-adjustments of the sublight drive. Commodore Kalen Voss adjusted his visual sensors, fighting the nausea brought on by the ship's artificial gravity vector. Humans did not use the smooth, frictionless grav fields favored by the Concordance. They used raw, high-density kinetic dampeners that yanked at a living body's internal organs with every turn. Beside him, Ambassador Valen sat huddled in a suspended containment harness, his delicate silica frame locked into place to prevent his bones from fracturing against the ship's brutal structural vibrations. "We are 50 astronomical units past the formal quarantine boundary," Valen's vocal module hummed faintly, the frequency trembling with exhaustion. "If the High Council learns we authorized this transit without an emergency quorum, the High Council is currently calculating orbital evacuation vectors for the inner worlds." Voss interrupted sharply, his visual carapace twitching as he stared at the primary display console. "They are terrified, Valen. For 3 centuries they believed our fleet's plasma arrays were the pinnacle of cosmic warfare. They do not know how to fight something that does not register on thermal sensors." A heavy, measured footfall echoed down the metallic catwalk behind them. Marcus stepped onto the command bridge, flanked by 2 Void Marines clad in non-reflective, matte black atmospheric suits. He held a wide, vacuum-sealed canister containing a dark, bitter liquid that steam rose from in thin, rhythmic wisps. He took a slow sip, his muddy hazel eyes fixed on the forward tactical array. "You're tense, Commodore," Marcus said smoothly. "Your ship moves like a falling anvil." "Human," Voss replied, his tone laced with suppressed hostility. "It lacks calibration. It lacks refinement." "It keeps us alive," Marcus countered, setting the canister into a magnetic recess on the primary console. "In a Deathworld ecosystem, refinement is just another word for fragile." He leaned forward, placing both massive, bare hands onto the console edge. The skin across his knuckles was thick, scarred from years of manual labor or raw kinetic combat. "Show them the long-range telemetry," Marcus ordered. An operator seated below the primary platform punched a sequence of manual switches. The central display flickered, replacing the grid map of the outer Sol system with a real-time gravitational density mapping. Valen leaned forward in his harness, his 4-jointed manipulators tightening until the joints clicked sharply. The display did not show ships. It showed a tear in the local dark matter grid, a massive, crescent-shaped shadow moving at 0.08 light speed. It was not burning fuel. It was not generating a localized warp bubble. It was simply consuming the ambient matter of the interstellar medium, pulling dust, stray asteroids, and radiation into its leading edge, and converting the mass into pure, compressed kinetic velocity. "It has grown," Valen whispered, his silica nodes vibrating in alarm. 3 cycles ago, its mass shadow was equivalent to 6 dreadnoughts. Now it approaches the mass of a small moon. "Because it ate your 3rd Dynasty research vessel," Marcus said coldly. "The Vorn don't carry supply lines. They don't have foundries. Every time they swallow an artificial construct, their internal biofactories break down the refined heavy metals and synthesize more hull mass. Your council didn't just lose a ship, Ambassador. You fed the apex predator on its way to our doorstep." Voss's carapace flared in defensive anger. It was an uncharted region, a routine navigational error. "It was negligence," Marcus cut him off, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly low, resonant register that vibrated through the floor plates. "And now the bill has arrived." A sharp synthetic chime chimed through the bridge module. The red lighting along the bulkheads dimmed, shifting to an intense, steady amber. "Contact," the tactical operator called out, his voice unnaturally calm, trained through endless simulations of total system failure. "Mass shadow crossing the 40 AU threshold. Target has altered vector. It has detected our thermal core." "Is it deploying fighters?" Voss demanded, his hand instinctively dropping to his ceremonial sidearm. "What is its fleet formation?" "It doesn't have a formation," Marcus said. He reached down and clicked a heavy mechanical safety switch on the main panel, arming the ship's primary kinetic banks. "It's a single, continuous biological machine, and it's hungry." On the main viewer, the blackness of space seemed to curdle. A wall of jagged, non-reflective material emerged from the void, stretching over 300 kilometers from flank to flank. It did not possess windows, bridge towers, or thruster ports. It was a writhing matrix of dense, calcified plates, chitinous spines, and pulsing, deep violet veins that glowed with harvested subatomic energy. Millions of tiny, needle-like appendages rippled along its leading edge, siphoning the thin gas of the Oort cloud. Valen felt his internal fluids lock in sheer, instinctual terror. This was not an enemy that could be reasoned with. It possessed no ideology, no politics, no flag. It was pure, unadulterated appetite, refined by a billion years of wandering the dead zones between galaxies. Tactical range in 10 seconds, the operator announced. Marcus did not issue a fleet command. He did not call for defensive shields. He simply stood with his feet planted wide on the carbine floor, his posture rigid, his face carved from unyielding stone. Primary battery, load tungsten carbide penetrators, sequence 1 through 4. Human, Voss barked, his voice laced with genuine panic. Your kinetic weapons will not breach an organism of that scale. The density of its outer shell will absorb physical impacts. You need concentrated plasma. You need energy dispersion. Energy dispersion is what your people used, Marcus said, without looking at him. Energy is hot. Energy spreads out. Energy feeds things that know how to drink it. He raised one heavy, scarred hand, his index finger hovering over a solid mechanical firing stud. Physics, Commodore, doesn't care if you're alive or dead. Physics only cares about mass times acceleration. Fire. The Aegis 7 did not hum with the clean, elegant discharge of an energy weapon. The entire 400-meter hull bucked violently, throwing Voss against his security harness as a deafening metallic thunderclap tore through the bridge. Deep within the ship's keel, 4 magnetic rail tubes discharged simultaneously, dumping gigawatts of stored capacitor energy into 4 solid, 200-ton tungsten spikes. The projectiles left the muzzles at nearly 3% of the speed of light. There was no visible beam, no glowing trail of ionized gas. There was only a sudden, catastrophic disruption of space between the cruiser and the oncoming shadow. On the main viewer, the leading edge of the Vorn construct simply disintegrated. The kinetic energy transferred upon impact was so immense that it did not merely punch holes through the chitinous armor. It converted the organic tissue and calcified plating directly into expanding clouds of superheated plasma and shattered crystalline shrapnel. The shockwave tore through the organism's internal structure, sending massive, violent ripples across its 300-kilometer frame. A high-pitched, warbling screech, transmitted through the density of the debris cloud, reverberated through the Aegis 7. Hull sensors. It's bleeding, Valen gasped, his visual array scanning the telemetry in absolute disbelief. You fractured its primary structural matrix with a single salvo. It's not dead, Marcus said, his hazel eyes tracking the vast organism as its torn flanks began to rigate, thousands of tendrils reaching out to pull the shattered pieces of its own body back into the main mass. It's just angry. And it knows where the kinetic energy came from. The crescent shadow swerved, its vast, jagged maw opening to reveal a dark, cavernous interior, lined with rows of biomagnetic rings that began to glow with a sickly, bruised violet light. They're charging a heavy plasma discharge, Voss yelled, pointing a trembling manipulator at the display. They harvested the heat from your impact. They are converting it. Let them, Marcus said softly. He turned his head toward the internal comms panel. Station 1, this is Marcus. Target has locked onto our position. Initiate the tether. A heavy mechanical thud echoed from the lower decks of the cruiser. On the tactical grid, a tiny, glowing golden icon detached from the rear of the Aegis 7. It was not a missile. It was a compact, spherical probe, no larger than a shuttle, anchored to the dead star ring thousands of AU behind them via a compressed, quantum-entangled spatial link. The sphere didn't fire thrusters. It simply opened its outer housing, exposing a tiny, stabilized fragment of dark matter density, a microscopic gravity well created in the deep underground labs of Earth. The Vorn's massive, biomagnetic plasma beam erupted from its central maw, a torrent of violet destruction, broad enough to vaporize a dozen Concordance frigates. It never reached the Aegis 7. The moment the plasma touched the localized distortion field around the probe, the trajectory of the energy bent wildly, sucked downward into the tiny, artificial gravity well, like water spiraling into a drain. The raw heat, the light, and the kinetic momentum were dragged into the quantum link, routed instantly across 50 light hours, and dumped directly into the collection grid of the black metal ring surrounding Sol's dead star. The human ship stood untouched in the vacuum, its carbine hull reflecting only the cold, distant starlight. Marcus took another slow sip of his bitter drink, his eyes never leaving the main display, as the Vorn construct shuddered, its energy reserves drained, its primary attack absorbed and repurposed into fuel for the human solar defense network. They spend millions of years evolving to swallow galaxies, Marcus whispered, a dark, predatory smile finally appearing at the corner of his mouth. And they never learned the most basic rule of the deep woods. He stepped toward the primary console, his heavy hand coming down on the manual cycling lever for the kinetic batteries. When you try to eat something bigger than you choke. Cycle batteries, Marcus commanded the bridge crew, his voice steady, rhythmic, and utterly devoid of mercy. Continuous fire, clear our lawn. The silence that followed the collapse of the Vorn construct was not the calm of a resolved crisis. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a slaughterhouse after the mechanized blades have finally spun down. On the bridge of the Aegis 7, the primary tactical display flickered as it processed the scattered remnants of the 300-kilometer biological anomaly, where a terrifying, galaxy-devouring entity had hung in the void moments prior. There was now only an expanding ring of frozen organic sludge, calcified armor shards, and inert, crystallizing tissue drifting aimlessly through the Oort cloud. Commodore Kalen Voss remained frozen in his command harness, his visual sensors locked onto the raw telemetry data scrolling down his secondary console. His silicate joints clicked once, twice, an involuntary physical tremor that his internal dampeners failed to suppress. "It is!" "Dissipated," Voss whispered, his vocal module struggling to synthesize the Kalen dialect's subtle tonal shifts into standard galactic High Gothic, the structural integrity of a Class 12 planetary threat mass, reduced to non-viable cellular debris in 412 seconds. "Not dissipated," Ambassador Valen corrected from his own harness, his voice thin, dry, and strained against the heavy artificial gravity of the human vessel. "Butchered." Marcus did not celebrate. He did not look at the alien officers, nor did he offer a boastful declaration to his crew. He stood at the edge of the central platform, his heavy hands resting on the carbine railing, his muddy hazel eyes watching the physical viewer above. "Cease fire," Marcus commanded calmly. "Vent the thermal buildup in tubes 3 and 4. Maintain long-range spatial scans. I want a clean sweep for residual mass signatures before we alter course." "Aye, sir," the tactical operator responded, his fingers flying across the manual switches with practiced, rhythmic efficiency. Thermal venting initiated, sensors checking clear across all primary vectors. Marcus turned slowly, his heavy boots thudding against the floor plates as he approached the two Kalen representatives. Up close, the heat radiating from his dense body was overwhelming to Valen, whose delicate silicate physiology was accustomed to the cool, nitrogen-thin atmosphere of the Concordance core worlds. "You have your answer, Commodore," Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that rattled through Valen's fragile ribcage. "The Vorn aren't immortal. They're just big." Voss unbuckled his harness with trembling manipulators, stepping down onto the catwalk. He looked up at the human, a creature half his height, lacking claws, armor, or bioenergy organs, yet possessing an internal density and a psychological willingness to inflict kinetic violence that defied every tenet of civilized galactic doctrine. "You used a microscopic singularity," Voss said, his carapace twitching violently as he confronted the human envoy. "You anchored a localized gravitational collapse inside a mobile vessel, linked it to a dead star, and weaponized the dark matter grid itself. That is a direct violation of the Sol Concordance Armistice of Cycle 9. The armistice was written by politicians who thought space was a garden, Marcus replied coldly, stepping into Voss's personal space without a trace of hesitation or fear. It was written under the assumption that the Concordance could enforce its laws if we stepped out of line. Tell me, Commodore, do you see a Concordance fleet out here enforcing the law? Voss's visual sensors flickered, but he remained silent. Your council sealed us inside this system 300 years ago, because you were afraid of what we were, Marcus continued, his tone dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying, ancient resonance of a predator born on a world where survival was a daily, brutal negotiation. You thought you were punishing us. You thought you were putting us in time out while you traded silk and minerals in your quiet little paradise, but all you did was isolate us with our own history. He reached out, his scarred, heavy fingers pointing directly at the main viewer, where the frozen remains of the Vorn construct were slowly being pulled into the gravity well of a distant outer dwarf planet. We spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of killing things that don't want to die, Marcus said softly. And now, the garden is burning, and you've come to the cage to beg the wild beasts to save you. Ambassador Valen leaned forward in his harness, his delicate 4-jointed hands raised in a gesture of absolute, unreserved submission. We are not here to command you, Marcus, Valen whispered, his vocal module dropping its formal, synthesized tone in favor of raw, unvarnished honesty. We are here because we have realized, far too late, that the universe is not civilized. The High Concordance is dying. The Vorn we faced at Orax 9 was not an isolated vanguard. Our deep space arrays, before they went dark, detected dozens of similar mass shadows entering the galaxy from the periphery void. Valen looked directly into Marcus's muddy hazel eyes, his silica frame shivering under the weight of the revelation. If your people remain inside this system, you may survive the first wave. You may even survive the second. But eventually, the sheer volume of the swarm will choke out your sons. You cannot fight an entire ecosystem alone. Marcus stood still for a long moment, the ambient red lighting of the bridge casting deep shadows across his weathered, scarred face. For the first time since Valen had met him on the orbital platform of Prime 12, the human did not immediately offer a cold, pragmatic retort. He looked at the tactical array, where the glowing golden ring surrounding the dead star of Sol 2 flickered steadily, a monument to human engineering, built on 3 centuries of isolation, fear, and relentless preparation. How many worlds have fallen? Marcus asked quietly. 17 primary systems in the outer arm, Valen replied mournfully. The Kalan homeworld of Silas 4 is currently within the projected path of the secondary mass shadow. 8 billion lives, incapable of defending themselves against a kinetic threat of this magnitude. Marcus took a deep, heavy breath, his broad chest expanding as his internal organs processed the rich oxygen mix of the ship's atmospheric loop. He turned to the tactical operator. "Signal the Sol Defense Command!" Marcus ordered. "Tell Admiral Jackson that the test phase is complete. The kinetic battery network is fully operational, and the quantum tether arrays held under maximum load." The operator paused, looking up at Marcus with a mixture of awe and disciplined resolve. "And the secondary protocol, sir?" "Initiate it," Marcus said. Voss's carapace flared again, his military instincts flaring in alarm. "What secondary protocol? What are you planning, human?" Marcus looked at the 2 alien officers, his expression unreadable, his eyes as cold and deep as the void outside the hull. "We're not going to stay in our cage, Commodore," Marcus said, his voice echoing off the carbine walls with the absolute, terrifying certainty of a species that had long since abandoned the concept of surrender. "We're going to open the door, step out into your garden, and show the rest of this galaxy what happens when you force a Deathworld to go to war." He stepped past them toward the bridge exit, his heavy boots striking the floor in a steady, unyielding rhythm. "Plot a vector for Silas 4, Marcus called back over his shoulder. "Inform the High Council that the Sol Alliance is deploying, and tell them to get their ships out of our line of fire." The void surrounding the Silas 4 orbital cluster was no longer space. It was a boiling cauldron of ion storms, shattered atmospheric containment rings, and the glowing radioactive debris of the Kalan 3rd Defense Fleet. 3 days had passed since the Aegis 7 breached the Oort cloud barrier. In that short window, the secondary mass shadow of the Vorn swarm, a colossal biological tide stretching across 2 million kilometers of deep space, had slammed into the Silas system. From the primary observation gallery of the human heavy dreadnought, Vanguard, Ambassador Valen watched his ancestral homeworld bleed. The planet below, once a shimmering jewel of delicate atmospheric ribbons and soaring silicate spires, was now crisscrossed by dark, jagged scars where heavy biological harvesters had touched down. The thin, high-altitude cities that hung like spun glass in the upper stratosphere were collapsing one by one, their structural anchors sheared through by kinetic spine bursts fired from the Vorn orbital vanguard. They didn't even attempt to negotiate, Valen whispered, his silica nodes rattling against his chest in a dry, rhythmic sorrow. His four-jointed hands pressed against the quartz carbine viewport, leaving faint, trembling smudges on the reinforced transparent alloy. They didn't send a signal. They simply descended. Beside him, Admiral Sarah Vance stood with her hands clasped tightly behind her back. She wore the sharp, high-collared service dress of the Sol Orbital Command, unadorned save for the silver starburst of a fleet commander on her lapel. Her gray eyes were fixed not on the dying planet, but on the tactical holosphere suspended in the center of the gallery. A species that consumes star systems doesn't have a word for diplomacy, Valen, Vance said, her voice dropping into a quiet, icy register that seemed to cut through the low thrum of the ship's sublight engines. They view your high-minded culture the same way your people view a patch of wild clover. You aren't an enemy to them. You're just raw carbon waiting to be processed. Commodore Kalen Voss stepped up to the edge of the platform, his military carapace scorched dark from the brutal transit through the Sol boundary. His visual sensors flickered as he analyzed the tactical sphere. Your fleet is outnumbered 4,000 to 1, Admiral, Voss said, his tone straddling the line between residual arrogance and absolute desperation. The local defense grid has collapsed. The Kalen High Command has ordered total planetary abandonment, but our transport ships are being intercepted in the upper thermosphere. If your ships do not engage immediately— If my ships engage prematurely, Commodore, Vance interrupted without turning her head, we become part of the debris field. She tapped a single control icon on her wrist-mounted interface. The holosphere shifted, zooming out past the burning atmosphere of Silas 4 to reveal the true scale of the human deployment. They had not arrived as a standard fleet formation. There were no broadside lines, no defensive screens, no ceremonial flagships holding the center. 36 heavy human vessels, each one a slab-sided dark gray monolith designed to absorb cosmic radiation and kinetic shocks, hung in a cold, silent perimeter along the system's outer Lagrange points. They were arranged in an asymmetrical geometric pattern that mirrored the violent, irregular fractures of a broken crystal. What is this formation? Voss demanded, his manipulators twitching as he tried to decipher the tactical layout. You have spread your firepower across 3 light seconds. You cannot establish a overlapping shield grid at this distance. Your flanks are completely exposed. We don't use shields, Commodore, Vance replied coldly. Shields are loud. Shields radiate thermal signatures across half a sector. Shields tell the hunter exactly where to throw the spear. She turned her head slightly, her sharp gray eyes catching Voss's flickering visual sensors. We are not here to shield Silas 4. We are here to set a trap. On the main viewer, the Vorn swarm reacted to the arrival of the human fleet. The massive, biological mass shadow, a writhing matrix of chitinous superstructures, biomagnetic plasma nodes, and millions of parasitic feeder drones, began to pivot away from the planetary atmosphere. To the swarm's collective consciousness, the 36 silent human ships did not register as a coordinated military force. They registered as isolated, high-density metallic nodes, concentrated pockets of heavy elements ripe for harvesting. A quarter of the swarm, a biological mass equivalent to 80,000 Concordance frigates, detached from the main orbital invasion force and surged toward the nearest human line. "They are taking the bait!" Marcus's voice boomed over the internal bridge comms. He was positioned 3 decks below in the Vanguard, central firing nexus, his heavy hands locked onto the manual override levers for the primary dark matter conduits. Range to lead biological construct, 50,000 kilometers, the tactical officer reported, his voice devoid of emotion, operating at the precise, mechanical rhythm of a human trained in Deathworld survival. Target acquisition locked across all 36 nodes. Valen held his breath, his delicate silica frame locked in sheer terror, as the screen showed the terrifying wall of bioflesh and crystalline spines rushing toward the silent human line. The Vorn construct opened its forward maws, revealing millions of bioplasma conduits glowing with that sickly, bruised violet light. "Admiral!" Voss yelled, his carapace flaring to its absolute maximum limit. "They are within plasma range. Fire your weapons! In the name of the ancestors, fire!" Vance did not flinch. She raised her right hand, her thumb resting against the mechanical chronometer on her ring. 3, 2, 1. "Initiate the grid," Vance commanded. Across 36 human warships, no lasers were fired. No plasma bolts tore through the void. Instead, every ship simultaneously discharged its primary forward anchor, not a weapon, but a high-mass gravitational harpoon forged from dense, collapsed dark matter alloys. The 36 projectiles did not target the Vorn ships. They targeted the empty space between the enemy formations, embedding themselves into the fabric of the local spatial grid. In a fraction of a microsecond, the 36 ships activated their quantum-linked gravity drives. The space between the human vessels didn't just bend, it collapsed inward. The 4,000 cubic kilometers of void, occupied by the advancing Vorn vanguard, was suddenly subjected to a localized, multi-vector gravitational shear. The sheer physical stress did not generate heat or light. It simply twisted the physical framework of reality within the designated zone. The Vorn swarm didn't explode. It was crushed. The 300-kilometer wall of chitin, bioflesh, and armored spines was violently folded in on itself. Thousands of biological constructs colliding with one another at relativistic speeds, as the artificial gravity shear dragged them into a single, hyperdense point of mass. Calcified plates shattered like glass. Biomagnetic organs ruptured under their own compressed weight. Millions of feeder drones were flattened into a microscopic slurry of organic waste. The warbling, telepathic scream of the dying swarm echoed through the vanguard. Sensor arrays, a sound so violent, so charged with raw, instinctual agony that Commodore Voss fell to his knees on the observation deck, his silica joints clicking violently as his nervous system overloaded. Valen stumbled backward, clutching his head, his visual sensors swimming in a sea of terrifying telemetry data. You didn't hit them with kinetic force," Valen choked out, his vocal module emitting a high-pitched broken hiss. "You twisted space. You turned their own mass into a hydraulic press." "Mass is a weapon, Ambassador," Vance said, stepping down from the platform and standing over the kneeling Kalan Commodore. "On Earth, we learned 10,000 years ago that if an animal is too big to cut with a knife, you drop a mountain on it." She looked out the quartz carbine viewport at the remaining 3/4 of the Vorn swarm, which had suddenly halted its planetary bombardment. For the first time since entering the Silas system, the biological hive mind seemed to hesitate, its collective consciousness reeling from the instant, catastrophic erasure of its vanguard. Marcus's voice crackled through the comm speaker, gravelly, cold, and entirely devoid of fatigue. "Admiral, the primary mass is attempting to disengage. They are shifting vector toward the system's outer jump point." Vance's expression hardened, her gray eyes reflecting the distant, burning fires of the Kalan homeworld below. "Negative, Marcus," Vance ordered into her collar comms. "No disengagement. The Concordance let these things hunt for 300 years, because they were afraid of getting dirty. We are going to teach this galaxy what happens when the prey turns around and hunts the wolf." She turned to the tactical console, her fingers tapping out a new series of strike coordinates. "All ships, advance formation gallows. Prepare kinetic sweeping salvos. Clean the orbit of Silas 4. Leave nothing for the scavengers." The orbital space above Silas 4 had transformed into a vast graveyard of frozen organic slush, shattered chitin, and the slowly venting atmospheres of 36 Kalan transport vessels that had been caught in the crossfire before the human fleet arrived. On the observation deck of the heavy dreadnought Vanguard, the air had grown cold, thick with the heavy scent of recycled oxygen and ozone. The human vessels moved through the wreckage with a slow, mechanical precision, their hull-mounted kinetic batteries cycling in rhythmic, thunderous pulses as they systematically pulverized any lingering fragments of worn biomas that showed even a trace of biomagnetic energy. Commodore Kalen Voss pulled himself up from the cold floor plates, his silica joints aching from the sheer physical pressure of the human vessel's artificial gravity field. He stood beside Ambassador Valen, watching the main tactical sphere with a mixture of profound awe and sickening dread. The Vorn secondary fleet, a force that had erased 3 entire star systems and annihilated the pride of the Concordance defense fleet in less than 2 cycles, was gone. It had not merely been defeated, it had been dismantled, torn apart by a species that treated the laws of orbital ballistics not as a science, but as a brutal, pragmatic art form. "They are retreating," Valen whispered, his vocal module emitting a dry, metallic buzz as he pointed a trembling manipulator at the long-range sensor grid. "The remaining mass shadows, they are breaking formation. They are pulling back past the system's outer gravitational boundary." "They are not retreating, Ambassador," Admiral Sarah Vance said, stepping up to the central railing. Her gray eyes were cold, reflecting the distant, pale blue light of Silas IV's dying star. "They are re-evaluating. A predator doesn't retreat just because it got bit. It backs off, calculates the cost of the kill, and looks for a weaker angle." She turned her attention to the internal communications panel. "Marcus, what is the status of the local planetary surface?" Down on the lower decks, inside the primary firing nexus, Marcus's gravelly voice crackled through the speakers, accompanied by the deep, heavy thud of hydraulic reloading mechanisms. "The orbital bombardment stopped 10 minutes ago, Admiral," Marcus reported. "The primary Vorn harvesters that touched down in the equatorial spires have detached their feeding tubes. They're trying to pull their biomass back into orbit before we sweep the lower thermosphere." "Can we clear them without collapsing the planet's upper atmospheric rings?" Vance asked. Marcus paused. In the background, the low, resonant thrum of the ship's dark matter conduits vibrated through the hull, a steady, hypnotic pulse that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. "If we use kinetic strikes, we'll blow out the remaining atmospheric anchors," Marcus replied calmly. "The spires will fall, and the Kalan survivors down there will suffocate within 3 cycles. We need a surgical option." Voss took a sudden step forward, his visual sensors flaring bright yellow. "A surgical option? You possess a weapon that can target biological matter on a planetary surface without shattering the surrounding architecture." "We have infantry, Commodore," Vance said, turning her head slightly to look at him. "In the forward staging bay of the Vanguard." 200 human Void Marines stood in absolute, unbroken silence. They wore no bright ceremonial armor, no crests of rank, no glowing heraldry. Their suits were dense, matte black atmospheric exoskeletons, forged from shock-absorbent carbine alloys, designed to withstand the crushing gravity of Deathworlds and the absolute zero of the deep vacuum. Each unit was equipped with heavy, short-barreled kinetic rifles, broad-blade thermal cutters, and localized gravity anchors strapped to their boots. They did not speak. They did not chant battle prayers. They adjusted their seals, checked their ammunition feeds, and waited for the drop bay doors to cycle open. Ambassador Valen moved toward the viewport, watching as 12 dark, needle-shaped drop pods detached from the belly of the Vanguard. Unlike the elegant, anti-gravity shuttles used by the Concordance, these pods possessed no repulsor fields. They fired heavy chemical thrusters, driving themselves straight down into the burning atmosphere of Silas IV, like black spears thrown into a storm. "They are dropping directly into the spire structures?" Valen gasped, his silica nodes shivering in sheer horror. "The structural integrity of those towers is compromised. The gravity differentials alone will." "They're trained for high-gravity combat, Valen," Vance interrupted, her tone flat, unyielding, and devoid of doubt. "Your people built those spires out of light, flexible silicates so they could sway in the wind. Our people grew up on a planet where the ground beneath your feet can shake, tear open, and swallow a city whole without warning. Down in the highest spire of the Kalan capital, a soaring structure of pale, translucent glass that reached 40 kilometers into the upper sky, the surviving members of the High Directorate were huddled inside a shattered council chamber. The air was thin, cold, and reeked of burning chemical insulation. Outside the tall arched windows, the sky was a dark, bruised purple, torn apart by the entry trails of falling Vaughn debris. At the far end of the hall, the massive bio-chitin door, a writhing mass of black spines that the Vaughn harvesters had grown over the exit to seal the council inside, was pulsating with a rhythmic, sickening heat. The creature was preparing to digest the room's atmosphere, pumping toxic digestive fluids through the vents. The High Counselor of Silas IV, an ancient Kalan, whose silicate frame was so fragile it required a static levitation harness, bowed his head in quiet acceptance. "The ancestors have turned their faces away," the counselor whispered, his vocal synthesizer producing only a faint, raspy whistle. "The Concordance fleet has failed us. Prepare the final memory cores. Let the outer worlds know how we died." A sudden, violent explosion tore through the outer glass ceiling. It was not the sound of a Vaughn plasma weapon or the high-pitched hum of a Concordance laser. It was the raw, deafening roar of a solid, heavy object, shattering reinforced quartz at 5 times the speed of sound. A dark, 4-ton steel drop pod slammed directly into the center of the council chamber floor, its kinetic impact sending a massive shockwave through the room that blew out the remaining windows and sent fragments of polished marble flying like shrapnel. The pod's side hatches didn't slide open. They were blown outward by explosive charges, clattering heavily against the stone floor. Through the thick cloud of dust and freezing atmospheric mist, 4 black-armored figures stepped out. Their heavy boots struck the cracked floor with a dense iron thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The lead Marine, a massive human whose suit bore the simple, unadorned designation Raven 1, raised a broad, heavy-barreled rifle, sweeping the room with a cold, mechanical speed. "Is this the Directorate?" the Marine asked through an external speaker. His voice was deep, filtered through a heavy atmospheric rebreather, sounding less like a living voice and more like grinding stone. The ancient High Counselor stared at the towering black shape, his visual senses wide with unadulterated terror. He had seen holograms of humans, had read the classified reports from the Sol quarantine zones, but standing in the presence of one was a physical ordeal. The air around the human felt heavy, dense, charged with a terrifying, latent violence. We are the Directorate," the counselor stammered, his levitation harness trembling. Who authorized this entry?" "Sol Alliance, 9th Orbital Division," Raven 1 replied simply. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned toward the writhing, spine-covered biological door at the end of the hall. "Clear the breach," the Marine ordered his team. 2 of the Void Marines stepped forward, pulling long, heavy cylinders from their back mounts. They didn't fire lasers or plasma. They slammed heavy, thermal thermite spikes directly into the soft, living tissue of the Vorn door. The chemical reaction was instant and horrific. A blinding, white-hot flame erupted from the spikes, burning at 4,000 degrees, a temperature so extreme, it didn't just burn the organic matter, it converted the bio-chitin directly into ash, vaporizing the creature's nervous matrix in less than 2 seconds. The Vorn door let out a high-pitched, wet shriek before collapsing into a pile of smoking black slag. Behind the door, a dozen Vorn feeder drones, horrific, multi-limbed constructs of bone, iron, and razor-sharp chitin, were waiting, their biomagnetic maws glowing with violet energy. Raven 1 didn't call for cover. He didn't order a tactical withdrawal. He took a single, heavy step forward, raised his kinetic rifle, and pulled the trigger. The sound that filled the ancient Kalan council chamber was a continuous, rhythmic thunderclap. The heavy, tungsten core rounds tore through the air, punching through the Vorn drone's calcified armor plates with horrific efficiency. Biological fluid, shattered bone, and torn muscle tissue sprayed across the pale silicate walls, as the 4 human Marines moved forward in a steady, unyielding line, firing continuous, controlled bursts that reduced the nightmarish apex predators to a mangled heap of meat in less than 12 seconds. When the firing stopped, the chamber fell into an absolute, ringing silence. Raven 1 stood amidst the dripping black remains of the Vaughn drones, his rifle held at the ready, his dark visor completely blank, reflecting only the burning sky outside. He turned slowly to look at the trembling Kalen Directorate. "Spire is clear," Raven 1 reported into his suit comms. "Securing the perimeter. Tell the fleet to bring down the heavy transports." He looked down at the ancient High Counselor, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of emotion. "You can put your memory cores away, old man," the human Marine said softly. "You're not dying today." The central assembly chamber of the High Concordance on Prime 12 had seen 3,000 cycles of intergalactic diplomacy, but it had never known a silence as absolute as the one that held it now. The vast amphitheatral dome, usually flooded with warm, bioluminescent blue light, was illuminated only by the stark, sterile glare of the central holographic projector. Suspended in the air above the empty obsidian table was the complete, unedited tactical record of the Silas 4 engagement. Every delegate from every sovereign species in the known sectors sat frozen in their elevated tiers. They watched in mesmerized horror as the holographic playback replayed the final moments of the Vaughn primary mass shadow. They saw 36 dark, angular human vessels twist the fabric of local gravity, using dark matter anchors to convert a galaxy-devouring swarm into a crushed, microscopic pearl of hyperdense carbon, before systematically sweeping the planetary atmosphere with kinetic fire. Beside the central podium stood Ambassador Valen and Commodore Kalen Voss. Valen's silica frame bore permanent stress fractures from his time spent under the crushing gravity of human ships, but his visual sensors were clear, focused, and steady. The projection faded, leaving only a glowing, high-definition map of the galaxy. Surrounding the Sol sector was a wide, red-bordered sphere, the expanded exclusion zone dictated by the Sol Alliance. The Prostara Valerian Grand Counselor, her translucent form suspended within a life support capsule that hummed faintly in the gloom, leaned forward over her podium. "The threat is erased?" the Grand Counselor asked, her voice carried directly into the minds of the Assembly via subdermal translation nodes. "The entity known as the Vaughn no longer advances upon the central core. The Vaughn swarm that entered our galaxy has been liquidated," Valen replied, his vocal module echoing through the vast, silent chamber with a crisp, newly forged authority. "Not driven back. Not appeased with border territories. Annihilated. Every bioconstruct, every feeder drone, and every central node was reduced to raw atomic scrap in less than 48 standard hours." A murmur swept through the rows of delegates, a fragile mixture of overwhelming relief and deep, icy terror. "Then we owe the Sol Alliance a debt of gratitude," a representative from the Trell Coalition declared, rising from his seat with a grand, sweeping gesture of his manipulators. "We shall drafting a formal resolution of appreciation. We shall offer them trade concessions, mining rights in the buffer zones, a permanent seat at the head of this very council." "Sit down, Trell," Commodore Voss growled, his voice cutting through the politician's bluster like a shattered blade. His military carapace, scarred and darkened by his time in the Deathworld fleet, did not flare in ceremonial display. It remained tightly locked, the stance of a veteran who had looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was armed with tungsten railguns. The Trell delegate blinked in shock. "I beg your pardon, Commodore. The humans do not want your resolution," Voss said, stepping to the edge of the central platform and looking up at the gathered elites of the galaxy. "They do not want your trade concessions. They do not care about your mining rights, and they view your seat at this council as an absurd, inefficient waste of time." Voss raised a single, armored manipulator and tapped a control on the central dais. A single document flashed onto the screens of every delegate in the amphitheatrum. It bore no ornate heraldry, no gold leaf, and no florid legal preamble. It was rendered in stark, heavy block lettering in standard High Gothic and Terran English. The revised Terra Accords version 2.0. 1. The expanded boundary, the Sol exclusion zone, is hereby expanded by an additional 10 light-years in all three-dimensional vectors. Any vessel belonging to any concordant species that crosses this boundary without 48 hours of prior explicit military clearance will be destroyed instantly. No warnings will be broadcast. No boarding parties will be dispatched. 2. The guarantee of neutrality. The Sol Alliance recognizes no authority, court, or decree of the High Concordance. The Alliance will not intervene in your internal political struggles, your trade disputes, or your domestic conflicts. In exchange, any attempt to impose economic sanctions, political pressure, or covert surveillance upon human space will be interpreted as an act of existential war, resulting in immediate, non-proportional retaliatory strike operations. 3. The Apex Mandate. The species of the Sol Alliance are the sole apex military power in this galaxy. Should an external threat, biological, mechanical, or extragalactic, endanger the continuity of sentient life, the Sol Alliance will handle the threat using whatever means, technologies, or destructive measures it deems necessary. The High Concordance will surrender all tactical command authority in the affected sector upon request. Failure to comply with these terms will result in the immediate withdrawal of Alliance protection and the deployment of localized dark matter containment field assets against non-compliant worlds. The chamber erupted into a chaotic storm of shouts, squawks, and panicked electronic feedback. Delegates slammed their fists against their desks, demanding order, accusing the Kalan representatives of treason, of capitulating to wild beasts, of destroying the foundational democracy of the stars. "This is tyranny!" the Draxian ambassador roared, his heavy jawplates snapping in fury. "They are dictating terms to 2,000 civilized species. They are forcing us to live in the shadow of their guns." "They are not forcing you to do anything, Ambassador," Valen said softly, his quiet voice miraculously carrying over the deafening uproar. His hazel-tinted visual sensors scanned the sea of angry, terrified faces. "They are simply telling you the truth about the universe we live in." The room gradually quieted, the sheer weight of Valen's calm statement cooling the rising panic. "For 3,000 cycles," Valen continued, stepping beside Voss, "this council built a culture on the assumption that peace was a natural state of being. We believed that if we spoke softly, used polite words, and wrote complex laws, the dark outside our window would somehow respect us. We treated strength as a primitive defect, and survival as a bureaucratic procedure." He reached down and activated a final audio log on the podium, a recording taken from the bridge of the Vanguard during the final moments of the Salus IV campaign. The voice of Admiral Sarah Vance filled the monumental space, low, gravelly, and unyielding as granite. "We didn't ask to be born on a planet that tried to kill us every morning." Vance's voice echoed off the ancient stone vaults. "We didn't ask for a gravity well that crushed our bones, an atmosphere that burned our lungs, or predators that hunted us in the night. But we survived it. We adapted to it. And when we finally reached the stars, we found a galaxy full of children, playing in a glass house, pretending the storm outside didn't exist." The recording paused for a long, heavy second. "The glass house is broken now. We cleared your lawn. We killed the thing in the dark. Now, go back to your speeches, go back to your trade treaties, and stay behind your line, because if you wake the beast in the cage again, there won't be an admiral left to ask for peace." The audio log clicked off. Silence descended upon the High Concordance once more, a silence that was absolute, permanent, and heavy with the realization of a new galactic era. High above the terminal station, far beyond the thick atmosphere of Prime 12, the massive, dark shape of the super dreadnought Vanguard hung in the void. It did not glow with ambient light. It did not display bright banners or broadcast welcome signals to incoming traffic. It sat like an ancient, black monolith against the sea of distant stars, its kinetic batteries cold, its dark matter engines idling in a silent, eternal watch. In the command nexus deep within its armored keel, Marcus stood alone before the forward viewport. He took a slow sip from a heavy ceramic mug, watching the distant, glittering lights of the alien capital station below. Beside him, the tactical display flickered quietly, showing a clear, empty perimeter stretching out across thousands of light years. The galaxy was quiet now. The garden had learned its lesson. Marcus turned his back on the viewport, his heavy boots striking the carbine floor with a slow, steady, unyielding thud as he walked back toward the dark heart of the ship. "Clear," he whispered to the empty room, and the deep space answered with only the cold, beautiful mechanical hum of an apex predator at rest.